Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Drinking with Authors. We have with us today JT Greathouse, and we're going to chat about his first book in what I've just learned is a trilogy called The Hand of the Sun King. JT Greathouse, let me not cover his name up. I met JT Greathouse at one of our agency dinners. We share the same agent, so it was great chatting with him there, and that's when I learned about the book and immediately ordered it, and I've been enjoying it. I haven't completely finished it, so you can't do any spoilers today. Not quite to the end yet, but we will chat about that in a second. Why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what you are drinking today?
Sure. So I'm, like you said, I'm JT Greathouse, science fiction fantasy author from Spokane, Washington. The Hand of the Sun King was my first novel, but I've had quite a few short stories and stuff published in like Beneath Ceaseless Skies and Intergalactic Medicine Show back before it closed. A couple other places. Mostly write fantasy, write some science fiction. But I'm today drinking just coffee, but I have this neat mug, which has a logo on it, which is sort of a local bit of lore here in Spokane. There's this public artist named Harold Belaze who made a lot of sculptures that are downtown. And one of them is this kind of like abstract, like rectangular cube thing that is down by the convention center. And it suspiciously looks like a ladder and is climbable. And on top has that little circle that says transcend the bullshit. And so it's a thing that like teenagers like to do is go down to the park by the convention center and climb this sculpture and like sit on top of it. And, you know, it's technically illegal, but you're kind of supposed to because part of the sculpture is only visible from above. And they make a mug that has it on it that they sell at a local coffee shop. So that's what I'm drinking today.
Coffee in a special mug. Drinking, people know I like this bourbon. I'm drinking Woodford Reserve bourbon at the moment, but I should have grabbed the bottle. The bottle's almost gone, so I'm going to have to switch to something else eventually here. Probably an interview or two. But cheers. Hopefully we'll still be coherent. Well, I'll still be coherent by the end.
I'm going to get more coherent because I'm drinking coffee and you're going to get less coherent. At some point, the lines will cross.
We are inversely proportional. A little bit of my math coming out there. Okay, so like you said, and like I said, we're going to talk about The Hand of the Sun King. So why don't you give us a little rundown of the plot, and obviously no spoilers, but sell us on your book.
Okay, so Hand of the Sun King is a coming-of-age fantasy story about a young man who grows up in a colonized country and at a very young age is exposed to some magic that his grandmother is able to use and becomes obsessed with it and wants to learn to master it. But his grandmother's magic has been outlawed by the Empire. And so in order to learn magic, he has to go and serve the Empire that conquered his country. And over the course of the novel, he learns magic, gets kind of embroiled in some imperial politics and stuff like that. And I can't really say more than that without spoiling anything. But it's, you know, coming of age, sort of inspired by some time I spent living in China and Taiwan in terms of the setting. And then the magic system is kind of based on the idea of canonicity and the way that empires take things from the cultures that they conquer and add them to the empire while simultaneously outlawing or banning the sort of normal or traditional practice of those same things.
Yeah. And that was a very good rundown, I think, without spoiling anything. I'm halfway through the book, a little over halfway through the book at this point. And I would say that one of the most intriguing things about the book is the actual setting. I mean, so far, I mean, the magic is there, and you've done some interesting things with the magic. Like I can see like avenues where we could go on the plot with the magic. But it's been the setting itself that's interested me the most. So you started talking about this a little bit with your intro there. So tell us a little bit more about the setting and the inspiration behind it.
Sure. So it's very much inspired by the year I spent after college teaching English in Taiwan. So my college degree is in history and philosophy with a focus on Asian studies. So I studied Chinese and particularly like Ming and Qing dynasty philosophy, like a lot of Neo-Confucianism and some sort of Taoist reactions to it and stuff like that. And then after college, my wife and I, after we got married, moved to Taiwan to teach for a while. And I was sort of struck by Taiwan's interesting sort of positioning within Asian history, where it's this little island that has been conquered and reconquered by all kinds of different, you know, other countries or empires. Like it was a Chinese colony as far back as the Ming Dynasty, and then it was a Korean colony very briefly, and it was a Japanese colony at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And then it was reconquered by the Kuomintang after the Chinese Civil War, and was ruled by a military dictatorship till like the 80s, and then became democratic. So its culture is like this interesting melting pot. But whereas arguably the culture of the United States is a melting pot by way of immigration, Taiwan is a melting pot by way of colonization. So every country that conquers Taiwan or has conquered Taiwan brought some of its culture there. And there are like vestiges of it all over the place. And it's really interesting to think about as this case study in, colonialism, post-colonialism. I met one of the most interesting experiences I had there was I was asking for directions from this older man who got very angry at me for speaking Chinese, for speaking Mandarin. And I didn't understand the interaction at the time. And then I was talking to a friend about it later, and he said, oh yeah, like there are people who are in their 70s who grew up under Japanese rule, experienced a very brief period of time of like independence where like before the KMT came, and then were reconquered by the KMT and forced to speak Chinese, and the Taiwanese dialect was outlawed and all this stuff. So like they had been forced to speak Japanese, and then there was like a window of freedom, and then they were forced to speak Chinese. And so it's this like interesting thing that I don't think certainly not white people in the United States ever experience, which is like being in a situation where you think you know how to navigate a culture, but there are all these little subtleties to it that are a product of its long history. And so I wanted to write, a setting that didn't, I don't think it's possible to fully capture that or even to fully capture my impression of it, but that like gestured toward some of those things.
Yeah, and Alder, who's your main character, he, one of the things I like is that, and he's a great main character for bringing what you just said out, because he's like trapped between two cultures. He's got the way he's been raised by his father, but then he's also got his mother's side, and obviously the training that he got from his grandmother. So he's like split. And one of the interesting things in reading the book is how he's trying to, I wouldn't say at this point he's actively attempting to integrate the two. I assume that he's probably headed in that direction eventually, but that's the writer in me trying to figure out where it's going to go. But it's very, very interesting that how he's trying to kind of at least straddle the two sides of his background. And I also wanted to comment on the fact that this is it's a fantasy novel, but it's not the traditional like medieval setting, in terms of Western Europe medieval setting, and so it's got that different type of setting, but at the same time it's not subtle. It is subtle. You're not throwing it in our face. I mean, the cool thing about it is that you don't spend hours describing the culture itself. Basically, one of the cool things is that he's just living it. And in my opinion, that's one of the best examples of how to handle setting, is that you don't want
Yeah.
to spend paragraphs describing the buildings and the, you know, coffee cups and all that kind of stuff. Is that the characters should just be living it. So talk about that a little bit. Is when you were writing this, did you actively have to like go back and cut things like that out, or did you just naturally just sit down and say, this is how he's going to live and I'm not going to worry about describing every little detail? How did you go about doing that?
Yeah. So I agree with you that the way to approach world building in prose fiction is to do it with like subtle touches. You know, I was rereading The Wheel of Time recently, and there are so many long sections where like I mean, I like those books, but Jordan spends so much time explaining like very, very specific details that don't matter to the story at all. It's like all the clothes everybody's wearing, how different the like styles of jackets are between two cultures and stuff. And it's like, it's cool, you know, texture, flavor, but it like doesn't matter. And so I've always had that attitude towards the way that I describe settings and describe worlds in my fiction. And I think part of it comes from the practice of writing short stories where you don't get to spend a lot of words just talking about what the world looks like and what all the little things are. You have to like pick your details carefully. So by the time I got to write The Hand of the Sun King, I was pretty well practiced in doing that. So I didn't have to go back through and cut a lot of description. I actually, I mean, you've worked with Joshua Bilmus, our agent, right? He always has notes, right? Most of his notes were about cutting internal monologue, not cutting description. And he would actually tell me to like add more description sometimes. But I think that part of it is like, I don't really write cinematically, if that makes sense. So I think that there's an approach to writing that's increasingly common where you like envision a camera that's floating around and showing stuff. And that's not really the way that I approach it. I don't think about what I'm writing in terms of there being a camera that's showing the audience things. I think about it from like the character's mindset in the moment. What are they thinking about? What are they noticing? What are they you know, in their environment, what are they interacting with that I can like use those interactions to show things about the world. But I never want to stop and just give you like a visual picture of the setting, because in our daily lives, that's not how we experience reality unless we are in like a really striking new environment. So there are sections in the book where like Alder goes to a new place and he sees something and he has this like snapshot moment where he's struck by what he's seeing, and I describe it in a lot of detail. But most of the time, if it's just his normal life, I describe it like his normal life, you know?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's what I try to do with my approach to writing as well. And just the idea that when a character goes into a room, they're going to see different things than the next character that goes in.
Yeah.
There, just because of their interests and you know, all that kind of stuff.
What they care about.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, this, I think that's one of the things that has drawn me into the book is that way that you're describing things, because it honestly, he doesn't really describe a whole lot. Like if I had to sit down and draw like a picture of his house when he was growing up, I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Maybe, you know, maybe I could draw a rough sketch of the like approach to the temple, you know, that where his grandmother trains him and stuff, because you do describe some things there, and because that's important to the plot. The things that you describe are important to the plot. And yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I enjoy Robert Jordan's books, but yeah, he gives you a lot of what I consider is essentially the author Bible for the world.
Yeah.
Only he's just like sharing it with everybody, and it's like, no, like you said, we don't need to know the differences in the jackets and stuff, unless, like you said, unless like you're in some scene where the distinction between the jackets is important to the plot, and then point it out.
So like a good example of that would be, I don't know if you've read Marie Brennan and Alec Helms' Rook and Rose books. The Mask of Mirrors is the first one. But in that, one of the point of view characters is a seamstress, and there are sequences where the cut of clothing or like the style of clothing tells us something meaningful about the character through the lens of this point of view. And that's really good. Like, and then that gives them a way to like show off all of these cool clothing designs that they've come up with in a way that's actually interesting to me as a reader, because it's conveying information in a way that like this character that's seeing it is interpreting for me. So like there's no rule, I think, about what you can and can't describe when you're writing fiction. It's just what you're describing needs to be, one, relevant to the character that's describing it. Like they need to have a reason to be paying this much attention to it. And two, it needs to communicate something to the reader that the reader cares about. Because otherwise you're just asking them to read like your cool details that you came up with.
Your author notes.
Just because you, yeah.
Basically your author notes. And I think it's interesting that you brought up that writing short stories kind of prepped you for that kind of approach. Because I founded the small press Zombies Need Brains, and we're focusing on anthologies, so short stories.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I think is good for writers to learn, is how to write short stories, even if they're writing novels, because of things like that. Like you said, short stories, you're massively restricted by word count. So you've got to really, really, really pay attention to like what's important and what's not. And should be doing that in novels as well. I mean, even though the structure's longer and you have a little bit more leeway, you don't want the 1,000-page novel that could really only be 300 pages, or at least I, as a reader, do not want that.
Yeah, I've definitely had reading experiences where I'm like halfway through a book and I'm like, this feels like it should be over by now. There's just too much in this novel, and usually it's because they don't have that discipline of like cutting down to the necessary, right? And I like long novels. Like one of my favorite books ever is War and Peace, which is hilariously long, but it's not just, despite being somewhat slow paced, it's never wasting your time. Like when Tolstoy tells you about something, you need to know it to make sense of the scene or make sense of the character, right?
Yeah.
And that's the key.
And I also think that it was interesting, like way earlier when we were talking, that you said that your degree, I'm assuming degrees, are in a focus on the philosophy of these cultures, and that's it. Like the minute you said that, I started shaking my head, because I was like, aha, now the whole section, the first whole section basically of the book makes a lot of sense. Because they always say that you should write what you know, and you can kind of see that in this. I've always interpreted write what you know to be like, if you've read hundreds of fantasy novels, then you should be writing a fantasy novel. You shouldn't say, I'm going to sit down and write a mystery, because fantasy, what the tropes are, that kind of stuff. But you are, in this case, you are actually taking your background, what you know, and applying it to the book. And I think you did it very well, because like I said, when you know something that well, it tends to be heavy-handed. But I don't feel like it's heavy-handed in this book. So
well, we'll see how you feel about that if you get to the second and third ones, where it gets a little bit more
philosophical.
Yeah. So the concept for the whole trilogy is actually inspired by my attempt to reconcile some thoughts I have about social and political philosophy. And like, I think there's a constant tension in every society between freedom and control, like on that axis. And the more freedom you allow, the more you risk chaos. And the more control you exert, the more you risk autocracy and oppression. And so like in Neo-Confucianism, that's a tension that exists, where like it's a pretty authoritarian philosophical system, and they basically justify it by saying like, we don't want chaos, we want order, and we have a massive country that we have to maintain and organize and operate. So we're going to have a very organized, hierarchical, political and social system. We in America, I think, swing a bit the other direction and allow for a little bit more chaos. But at like when you have catastrophe or you have like disruption in your social structure, there's a tendency to want more control. And so without spoiling anything, the overall arc of the trilogy deals with that problem. And it like even the backstory of the series deals with that problem in terms of like the impulse to want to exert more control and have more authoritarian government. And so like in the very beginning of the book, you know, Alder's preparing for the imperial examinations, and I use that as an opportunity to raise some of these questions that kind of follow through the first book, but really like start snowballing into a big thematic thing in the second and third ones. So,
Well, that makes sense though, because right now Alder basically, even though he's like left his house and you know he's moving up in the world, let's say, not the way he intended necessarily, but up in the world. Like right now, at the beginning of the book, he has no power, so it's hard to start dealing with those types of questions until he gains some kind of power somehow. That totally makes sense that these kinds of things would come out more in book 2 and book 3, which brings up the fact that there are sequels. One of my questions before we started is, right now the Hand of the Sun King is the only book that's out, and it does say book 1 in the beginning, so I assumed that there were sequels. Oh, you even have a subtitle, Pact and Pattern. I didn't notice that before. So tell us about book 2 and book 3. When do you have like a date for when book 2 is coming out? What's going on with book 3? All that kind of stuff.
So book 2's done, like done. I just finished page proofs on it. So everything's locked and loaded. It's coming out August 4th, I believe is the date. And, you know, Glance will be putting it out in the UK, just like they did with the first one. And then Jabberwocky's doing the US release again. So that should be available, you know, anywhere pretty much, Kindle, or surprisingly, I sell a surprising number of print copies in the United States, considering it's effectively self-published. But, you know, they've done a good job getting it available through Ingram and stuff like that. So that's been cool. And then book 3, I am 85,000 words into the first draft, projecting it to be about 140 to 150. So I'm like a little bit over halfway done with the first draft of book 3. The goal is to finish it by August of this year. But, you know, it's been kind of a crazy year. School's been wild. And, you know, I'd be happy if I finish it by the end of the year, and then it'll hopefully come out sometime next year.
Okay, so August, because I know before we got on here on Zoom, I checked to see if I could pre-order book 2, but I didn't see it up yet for pre-order in the US. I don't know. It might be pre-orderable in the UK. But yeah,
I think it is in the UK. I think we might still need to finish a few things in the US for it to be ready to go. But yeah.
But I will keep an eye out for it. What's it called?
The Garden of Empire is book 2.
Garden of Empire. Okay.
Yeah, and then book 3 does not have an official title yet.
And that is because they're not happy with the title you came up with, or you didn't have a title?
I am not totally sure what I want the title to be yet. I have like a working title, but I tend to sort of find the titles in writing the book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I do that with short.
Yeah, and so and so I haven't finished it yet, and so like I have an idea for the title, but I want to finish the book before I, you know, tell anybody else about it.
Or you commit,
because I might come up with something else.
Yeah, the short stories for me, I never have a title when I start, basically, or I have like working title kind of thing. But novels, I have a tendency to have a title already in a particular series. one of the interesting things about this book that we haven't talked about yet is the fact that it's first person. My first person trilogy for DAW, or my first trilogy for DAW was first person, but I didn't realize at the time that I sold it that that's kind of rare, especially for kind of an epic fantasy novel series. So why don't we shift a little bit and talk a little more about writing? We've been doing quite a bit of that already, but focus a little bit more on first person. Why did you choose first person? And you know, what kind of challenges have you run into with first person?
Yeah. Well, I chose first person because I really like first person narration in general. So like one of my favorite books of all time, which is actually, I have the special edition behind me, is The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, which is a masterclass in first person narration where you have a character telling the story of something that happened to them. And I like it because it interjects sort of naturally this like sense of unreliability, right? Because when somebody's telling you a story about themselves, you're naturally going to be a little bit suspicious of any grandiose claims that they make, right? Like, are you just trying to make yourself look good, or is that true? You know, like again in Book of the New Sun, Severian tells the reader like, I have a perfect memory, and then he starts like making mistakes in terms of the continuity of what's happening, and so you're keyed in pretty quickly, like, oh, he's not actually telling me an accurate picture of the situation here. And so when I started writing Hand of the, sorry, yeah, an unreliable narrator, and you can do that in third person, but I think first person lends itself better to that.
Yeah.
And one of the things I want to do with, particularly with the Hand of the Sun King, but with the whole series, is it's not so much that Alder is unreliable, so much as he doesn't necessarily, like, he has certain feelings about the story that he's telling us, and that colors the way that he tells the story, right? Like you might yeah.
I was gonna say that's natural. I mean, you're basically going to be told the story the way that they want it to be seen.
Yeah. And so as the series goes on, actually in books 2 and 3, Alder's point of view is still first person, but he's telling the whole story. And there are things that happen that he is not an immediate witness to, that he learns about, you know, from the people that it happened to, but he's still the narrator. So it's in third person, but it's still Alder telling the story, and it's still colored by his attitudes towards what's happening, right? And the reason I wanted to do that is because, again, like the book is dealing with a lot of questions of identity and questions of like philosophical questions that Alder comes down on a side of at a certain point, right? And he isn't necessarily always on that side of the question over the course of the whole story. He has a lot of regrets, and a lot of things happen because of decisions that he makes that he that teach him that those things that he did were mistakes, right?
Well,
and I think it's interesting.
Even the half of this book that I've read that's already occurred, where he's going along, and it's like he's interpreted the situation in one way, and as a reader, you know, you don't really have a whole lot of other context, so you kind of just go along with it. And it isn't until another character kind of points out that, hey, you're misinterpreting this, or maybe you should look at it from this perspective instead, and he actually changes his mind. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of in my opinion, of section 2 of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to be vague because I don't want to spoil it's in section 2. But yeah, that happens even in just that little section. I can't even imagine what's going to happen on the grander scale.
Yeah. And I think that's what writing that kind of story in first person does for you as a writer, is it gives you ways of creating tension. through the narrative voice that you don't necessarily have access to writing in third person, or at least it's harder or clunkier to do in third person. But like Alder can, as he's telling us the story, he can just come out and foreshadow something that's going to happen later, right? He can be like, this is happening now, and if only I had thought about this, I might have done something differently. And he doesn't tell you yet like why he feels that way, but he's hinting to you like, I'm about to make a mistake, right? And then you as the reader start wondering like, okay, how is it a mistake, and how is it going to ripple out later to kind of help him understand that it was a mistake and things like that. And I just think that's cool. I think that's an interesting way of telling the story, and I think it lends itself to the kind of like Bildungsroman story I'm telling of somebody growing up and learning lessons and changing their mind about a lot of things, because again, it has that like reflective component to the narration. So yeah, and one of like, it's interesting that you say that, or you said earlier that it was sort of hard to sustain first person narration across 3 books. And I feel that way too, which is why I cheated and added some other point of view characters sneakily, who then tell Alder about stuff that happened to them, so he can then tell us about it, and it can still technically be his voice, but yeah, anyway.
Well, that's one of the things you run into, especially in like an epic fantasy setting like this, because it's really hard to get epic without doing something to kind of cheat a little bit, because you know, not everything can happen to this one character, right? Realistically, anyway.
Yeah.
So you start
yeah
things like in I didn't do this in my book, and you haven't done it in this book yet, but you know, the whole, you know, like, oh, I found a secret passage and now I'm hearing this conversation I'm not supposed to be hearing, you know, the whole eavesdropping trope and all that kind of stuff. You can only do that so many times before you know that it becomes obvious that that's what you're doing. So like my book, I did something different, it sounds, than you. In my Thrones series, I used the magic itself to kind of get around that. And I have to say I was pretty proud when I came up with how that worked. Because you know, you're constrained, especially at that point, because book 1 was out already. I couldn't change anything in book 1, so my magic system was set, you know, it was fixed, so I had to come up with some way to get around it. So what you're saying with your series though is the one of the ways you got around it is that because you're telling this kind of Alder's future self is telling this, you're saying that you had like Alder had conversations with other people about what happened, and so now Alder's telling his version of what they said happened.
Kind of. We can call it conversations. I don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, he is relaying an astonishingly accurate portrayal of the thoughts and experiences of other people, that he has reason to have access to their thoughts and opinions about stuff. But it's still filtered through him because he's the one who's telling you the story. Yeah. But yeah, anyway, again, I'm a huge Gene Wolfe fan. I like coming up with screwball ways of making the narrative a little bit like uncomfortable, or a little bit like the narrative's voice, I should say, just like a little twisted in some way, right? Not quite to the degree of like Latro in The Mist, where Wolfe's got a soldier who can't form new memories, and so he like sometimes will seem like a completely different character because he woke up one morning and forgot everything that had happened so far in the book. But I do like to do things where characters have ways of knowing things that we as normal people might not have, because magic exists, and that gives, you can do weird stuff with that.
So you did use the magic a little bit to get around the whole first person thing.
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. I can't wait to get to some of those sections and figure that out. I mean, I'm only halfway through book 1, and I already realized that you can't quite trust exactly how Alder is presenting everything. So I think that's good. Because I can only imagine it's going to get more complicated. The situations where he's lying to himself or lying to us get more complicated. So I don't know. That's interesting. One of the things I learned when I was writing first person or playing around with first person, though, is, and I think this is good to know just for writers in general, is that the key was to get rid of as many I's as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, you're supposed to be in the character's head, right? So you don't need to be saying I said this or I heard this, or So one of my key lessons was, I mean, basic lesson was when I was writing first person to cut out as many I's as I could.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. Actually, so that's one of the things that I like about writing first person as well is I find it more natural to drop some of the sort of filtering verbs, right? So like when I write third person, I have a tendency to write he heard somebody walking down the corridor, which is incredibly boring. Much more interesting to describe the sound of somebody walking down the corridor and just let it be filtered through the narration. Like the fact that the point of view character heard it is implied, right?
Yeah.
And in first person, like you say, just get if you're reading a paragraph and you used I frequently, especially in the context of describing something that's not actually an action, right? Like I killed a guy is different from I saw someone get killed. If your narrator saw someone get killed, just describe it happening, and it'll be more interesting.
Yeah. That was probably the biggest quote unquote lesson I learned attempting to write that book is, and you're right, it does apply, especially with the current convention of writing third person limited.
Mm-hmm.
Writing third person, but you're only from one character's POV in that particular scene, then you don't need to be saying he said and he heard and all that. It's implied that it's their POV. So you're cutting out as much of that as possible. But okay, now that's getting like way too technical for the writing lesson for the day. But I'm glad to hear that there's a book 2 and a book 3 coming. And like I said, I will pre-order. I get paper copies of everything, so I will pre-order a paperback of that or a hardcover of that if it's coming out in hardcover.
It is in the UK, so like I think you can order them through Blackwell's is a UK bookstore that does not free, but like pretty cheap shipping to the United States. I have a few friends who got the hardback of book 1 through them. So that's my suggestion for people who like hardbacks and don't live in the United Kingdom and want hardbacks of my books is order them from Blackwell's.
Blackwell's? Okay, we'll make note of that. So why don't you tell us like where we can find you online, like web pages, all that kind of stuff, and then we will tell everybody to go buy the book.
Sure. So I'm on Twitter a lot, probably too much, at Jeremy TEG. And then you can also find me on my website, although I don't post there very often anymore. I should more than I do, but it's jtgreathouse.com. Or jtgreathouse.wordpress.com. And I'm also on Facebook as I think Jeremy TEG author. So those are kind of the 3 places that I'm most frequently present. If you like cat pictures, you can follow me on Instagram. I post a lot of pictures of my cat. And I think that's Jeremy TEGRO because I need to like clean up my internet presence and get JT Greathouse on everything. Because I'm like using sort of legacy accounts from before I was an author, but yeah.
Oh, it's even worse with me because I had the pseudonym of Ben Tate for a while, and so like my Twitter is Ben Tate, but my Facebook is Joshua Palmatier. I'm all over the place as well. So I understand that trauma there. But everybody go check you out. Friend you on Facebook, follow you on Twitter, all that kind of stuff. Again, the book, the first book in the trilogy is called The Hand of the Sun King, JT Greathouse. Definitely go pick it up. Like I said, I think the world is very interesting. I think the kind of split, I wouldn't say split personality, but the split backgrounds of the main character are interesting. I want to see where all of that goes and how I'm assuming that he integrates them, but I don't know. Maybe he chooses a side. We'll have to see. Everybody
You'll
go
have
out,
to read
buy
and
the
find out.
books. Check out JT Greathouse. And any famous last words here on the chit chat?
No, but thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And like I said, I look forward to finishing book 1 and getting book 2. Okay, so thank you all for stopping by and joining us for our next Drinking with Authors interview. I don't know who it'll be, but I'm sure it's pretty interesting. Okay, catch you guys later.